David Brenner was thinking about his girlfriend when the ship exploded. He was 24 years old from Philadelphia, and he had been staring at the same radar screen for 3 hours straight. The merchant vessel SS Cyclops was carrying petroleum and ammunition across the Atlantic. The crew had trained for this route dozens of times. Brenner knew the routine: 6 hours until dawn. Then everything would be fine. His girlfriend's name was Margaret. She worked in a clothing factory. They had planned to get married after the war. He was saving money. He had saved $300 so far. He wanted it to be enough for a down payment on a small house. Margaret wanted a backyard. They would have children. 2, maybe 3. This was what he thought about when the night shift became boring. At 21:48 hours on March 15, 1942, a German U-boat commander named Klaus Schäfer gave an order that would change everything. The torpedo ran silent through the Atlantic. It was powered by electric motors, which meant no bubbles, no wake, no warning. Just 200 feet below the surface of the dark water, moving at 8 knots directly toward the starboard side of the Cyclops. Brenner heard the sound first. Not a bang. Not what you would call an explosion. It was more like the entire world suddenly folded in on itself. The radar screen in front of him flickered once and turned black. The lights died. For half a second, there was perfect darkness. And then there was fire. The torpedo struck with the force of 60 tons of TNT. It tore through the hull like paper. The metal walls of the ship screamed as they twisted and collapsed. Water rushed in. Fire rushed up. Men on the deck above were thrown into the air as if they weighed nothing at all. Brenner's body moved before his mind could process what was happening. He was moving down, or the ship was moving down. He could not tell anymore. His last conscious thought was of Margaret. He thought about the house. He thought about the backyard. Then the deck came down and crushed his spine, and David Brenner was no longer thinking about anything at all. 3 levels below Brenner, the radio operator was trying to send a distress signal. His name was Thomas Fisher. He was 19 years old. He had been trained to send Morse code in his sleep. He had practiced it 1,000 times. But now, his fingers would not work. The radio console in front of him was shaking. The walls were shaking. The floor was tilting at an angle that seemed wrong. Fisher pressed the transmission button. He wanted to scream words into the radio. He wanted to tell someone what was happening. He opened his mouth, but instead of sound, there was just the sensation of his lungs filling with water. The torpedo had opened a hole in the hull less than 30 meters from where he sat. The Atlantic Ocean was pouring in. Fisher had maybe 5 seconds left. He did not use those 5 seconds to send a signal. He did not have time. The water reached his nose and then his mouth and then his eyes. It was cold. This was the last thing he felt. Not fear, just cold. Then nothing. On the bridge, Captain William Rubin watched as the stars tilted sideways. This was not right. Nothing was right. He had been a ship captain for 18 years. He had crossed the Atlantic 43 times. He understood ships. He understood the sea. But he had never understood anything less than he understood what was happening right now. The Cyclops was sinking fast. The angle was getting steeper. The stern was rising. Soon the whole ship would stand up on its end and slide backward into the water. Captain Rubin knew this without being told. He did not need to be told. The physics of it was obvious. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. The order was unnecessary. The crew was already abandoning ship. They were running. Some of them were jumping. The lifeboats were either gone or unreachable. 68 men would end up in the cold Atlantic water that night. Only 23 of them would survive until morning. The Cyclops sank 3 minutes after the torpedo hit. She went down fast. The water was over 1,000 meters deep. The ship would come to rest on the bottom, and no one would ever see her again. She would just become a statistic. One more entry in the long list of ships that did not make it across the Atlantic. On the bridge of the U-553, Klaus Schäfer watched through the periscope as the Cyclops went under. This was the 5th ship he had sunk in 3 weeks. 5 ships, hundreds of men. Some of them were probably dying right now in the dark water below. Some of them were probably already dead. Schäfer did not think about this. He was a professional. He had a job to do. The job was done. He ordered the submarine to surface. He wanted to search for survivors to interrogate. The U-553 rose slowly through the water. When she broke the surface, the crew could see wreckage floating in the moonlight. There were bodies. There was debris. There were men in lifeboats. There were men in the water who were not in lifeboats. They were just swimming, or trying to swim. Many of them would not be swimming for much longer. One of those men was David Brenner. He had survived the impact somehow. His left arm was broken in 2 places, but he was alive. He had dragged himself out of the ship before it went under, and now he was floating in the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the night, and he could not feel his legs anymore because the water was too cold. The Germans pulled 4 men aboard the U-553. They took Brenner first. He was conscious. He could answer questions. Schäfer asked him in German. Brenner did not speak German. Another officer translated. Brenner told them the ship was carrying petroleum and ammunition. He told them the ship was from an American convoy. He told them this was all the information he had. After 2 hours on the submarine, the Germans released the survivors. Or rather, they were returned to the lifeboats. Schäfer was following maritime law. The law said you could sink merchant ships, but if you captured survivors, you had to either treat them as prisoners or let them go. Schäfer chose to let them go. It was more efficient. It was also probably more lethal, but Schäfer did not think about this either. The U-553 submerged at 23:47 hours. She turned south and began hunting for the next target. Schäfer had already mentally filed away the information from this sinking. One more ship, one more step closer to winning the war. Or at least, this was what he believed. 3,000 kilometers away in Washington District of Columbia, a man named Henry Leroy was sitting in a basement office reading casualty reports. Leroy was 29 years old. He had graduated from Yale with a degree in mathematics. He was supposed to be solving problems. Instead, he was reading lists of dead men. The reports came in every morning: ships sunk, men killed, cargo lost. Leroy was one of 10 intelligence officers assigned to analyze the patterns. His job was to figure out where the U-boats were hunting. His job was to figure out how to stop them. But Leroy had started to notice something strange. It was very small. It was almost nothing. But once he saw it, he could not stop seeing it. The U-boats were not hunting randomly. They were hunting along specific routes, at specific times, on specific dates. The attacks did not follow a pattern that made sense if you assumed random hunting. The pattern only made sense if you assumed the German captains were thinking like predators. Leroy had been a hunter as a boy. His father had taken him into the woods in New Hampshire. They had hunted deer. His father had taught him that animals think in predictable ways. They follow paths. They hunt at certain times. If you understand the animal, you can predict where it will go. Leroy was starting to think that U-boat captains thought like animals too. They followed paths. They hunted at certain times. The question was whether Leroy could figure out what they were thinking before they struck. He was 3 weeks away from an answer that would change the entire war in the Atlantic. He did not know this yet. He was just reading casualty reports and making notes. But somewhere in these reports was the beginning of an idea that would eventually turn the Atlantic into a graveyard for German submarines. An idea that would come from mathematics and psychology and the simple fact that predators are always predictable to those who understand how to think like them. But on this night, Henry Leroy had no idea any of this was coming. He was just making notes. He was just reading about dead men he had never met. He was just trying to find a pattern that might help save the next ship, the next crew, the next man who was thinking about his girlfriend in the dark Atlantic. Margaret Brenner was writing a letter she would never send. She was at a desk in her apartment in Philadelphia. The letter was to David. She had started it 3 days ago, but the words kept coming out wrong. She wanted to tell him about her day at the factory. She wanted to tell him about the small things that made her think of him, the way the spring light came through the windows, the way the radio played that song he liked. Margaret did not know yet that David was dead. The telegram had been delayed. It would arrive tomorrow. For now she was still writing to a ghost, and the ghost was still real in her mind. Henry Leroy was 3,000 kilometers away, and he did not know who Margaret was. He did not know that somewhere a young woman was writing to a dead man. But Leroy did know this. He knew that Margaret's letter would never be read. And he knew that if nothing changed, there would be 1,000 more letters like it. 1,000 more young women writing to dead men who would never read another word. The casualty reports were stacked on his desk at 4 in the morning. Leroy had not slept. 23 ships sunk in March. 467 men dead. But Leroy was not thinking about the numbers anymore. He was thinking about the Margarets, the mothers, the daughters, the friends, the people who would never understand why the ocean took what it took. His cigarette had burned out. He lit another one. On his desk was a map of the Atlantic. Leroy had marked every sinking with a red pin. 23 red pins. But when he looked at them now, he saw something different than he had seen before. He saw a line, not a straight line, not even a pattern that made sense at first, but a rhythm. Leroy stared at the dates written on a yellow pad in front of him. March 3rd, SS Cyclops, 200 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland. March 8th, SS Redfern, 190 kilometers from the Cyclops. Same general area. March 15th, SS Marigold, 185 kilometers from the Redfern. March 21st, SS Neptune, 200 kilometers from the Marigold. March 27th, SS Athena, 195 kilometers from the Neptune. 5 ships, 5 holes in Leroy's paper, all of them in roughly the same area of ocean, all of them at night, all of them within a 200-kilometer radius of each other. Leroy's hands started shaking. The gaps between the sinkings were not random. March 3rd to March 8th was 5 days. March 8th to March 15th was 7 days. March 15th to March 21st was 6 days. March 21st to March 27th was 6 days. The U-boat commander was not hunting randomly through an infinite ocean. He had established a territory. He was hunting in one specific zone, and he was coming back to that zone again and again. This was not coincidence. This was hunting. Leroy pulled out files on U-boat commanders. Klaus Schäfer. He had confirmed kills dating back to January. Leroy plotted those on a new map. Same area, same rhythm. Schäfer had found a hunting ground, and he was using it systematically. He was thinking like an animal. He was thinking like a predator that understands supply lines and territories and kill zones. But there was something deeper, something more sophisticated. Leroy looked at the dates again. Every sinking had occurred at night. Every sinking had targeted merchant ships carrying valuable cargo. Every sinking had occurred when visibility was poor and merchant escorts were minimal. Schäfer was not just hunting in a territory. He was hunting according to a precise methodology. He was choosing the optimal conditions for maximum success. The realization hit Leroy like a physical force. If Schäfer was thinking this systematically, then Schäfer could be predicted. If Schäfer could be predicted, then Schäfer could be stopped. If Schäfer could be stopped, then other U-boats could be stopped too. If other U-boats could be stopped, then the ships in the Atlantic would stop sinking. If the ships stopped sinking, then the Margarets would stop writing letters to dead men. Leroy filled 40 pages with calculations. He did not stop. He worked through the night and into the dawn. By the time the sun came up over Washington, Leroy had mapped Schäfer's entire hunting pattern. He had predicted 5 zones where Schäfer would likely hunt in April. He had calculated the optimal times for those hunts based on weather patterns and shipping schedules. He had created a system that violated every principle of randomness and made perfect sense as a system of predatory behavior. At 6 in the morning, he went upstairs. Admiral Fairfield's office was on the second floor. Leroy knocked on the door, even though he knew the admiral would not be there yet. He taped his papers to Fairfield's desk anyway. 40 pages of calculations. Maps with predictions. A thesis written in numbers and logic that said the U-boats were not winning because they were superior. They were winning because American Naval Command had not learned how to think like predators. Fairfield arrived at 7:30. He looked at the papers. He read the first page. He looked at Leroy. "You have not slept," Fairfield said. "No, sir. You did this in one night." "Yes, sir." Fairfield set down the papers and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "If you are right, Leroy, we change how we fight this war. We position escorts in these zones. We sink U-boats before they sink our ships. We stop the bleeding." "Yes, sir. But if you are wrong, you will have wasted military resources on a theory. And while we are in these zones waiting for Schäfer, ships in other areas will be sunk by other U-boats. More men will die because of your mathematics." "I understand, sir." "You are also arrogant," Fairfield said, turning to face Leroy. "You are a young man with a theory and no combat experience. You have never seen a ship die. You have never seen men in the water. But you come to me and tell me to change naval strategy based on your calculations." Leroy did not argue. He thought of Margaret Brenner writing a letter to her dead fiancé. He thought of David Brenner in the cold Atlantic water, unable to breathe. He thought of the 68 men on the Cyclops and the 45 who did not survive. "The men will die anyway, sir," Leroy said quietly. "If we do nothing, they will keep dying. At least this way, we try something." Fairfield looked at him for a long moment. 2 weeks, he said. "I will give you 2 weeks. We will implement your convoy positioning in these 5 zones. If Schäfer appears where you predict he will appear, you have your authority to continue. If he does not appear, you will be transferred to a desk job in Alaska, and your career in intelligence will be finished." Leroy felt the weight of this settle on him. 2 weeks, 14 days, 336 hours. Either the U-boats would appear in his predicted zones, and American ships would survive, and the Margarets would receive letters instead of telegrams. Or Leroy would be wrong, and more ships would burn, and more men would die, and it would be his fault. "One more thing," Fairfield said. "Do not tell anyone, not your colleagues, not the Navy, not your family. If this theory fails, I want no one else connected to it. You failed alone. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "And Leroy, do not become confident in your success before it happens. I have seen confident men die in this war. I have seen their confidence written on letters to their mothers. Confidence without verification is just guessing. Do not guess." Leroy walked out of the office and down the stairs to the basement. He sat at his desk and looked at the map with the 5 predicted zones marked in green ink. Somewhere in those 5 zones, Klaus Schäfer was moving through the Atlantic. Schäfer had no idea that an American mathematician in a basement had learned to think like him. Schäfer had no idea that his hunting pattern had been decoded. Schäfer had no idea that his next attack would trigger a trap that would change the entire war. But Leroy would not be confident about it. Leroy would not celebrate before it happened. Leroy would just wait. For 2 weeks he would wait and watch the reports from the Atlantic, and if even one ship appeared in one of his predicted zones, he would have his answer. He would know that humans were predictable. He would know that thinking like a predator could kill a predator. He would know that mathematics could win wars. 14 days. That was all he had. April 3rd, 1942, 4 in the morning. The USS Roper cut through the Atlantic at 15 knots. She was a destroyer escort, which meant her job was simple. Find submarines. Kill submarines. Captain Hamilton had received strange orders the night before. Specific coordinates. a specific date, a theory written by a mathematician. Hamilton had read the analysis twice. It looked insane. But orders were orders. At 04:17 hours, a sonar operator named Jackson shouted into the speaking tube, "Contact, 200 meters starboard, bearing 180, battle stations, all hands, man your positions." The ship came alive. Men ran to their stations. Anti-submarine weapons were armed and loaded. The USS Roper had been waiting for this moment. Now it had arrived. Klaus Schäfer was in the control room of U-553 when he heard the first explosion. The depth charge was 200 meters away. He could feel it through the hull, through the water, through the metal. Schäfer had been attacked before. Schäfer understood submarine combat. He gave the order to dive deeper and shut down all non-essential systems. The U-553 slipped down into the cold Atlantic water. 04:45 hours, 28 minutes of continuous depth charging. The explosions came from all directions. Schäfer could not understand how the Americans had found him, could not understand why destroyers were positioned exactly where he was hunting, could not understand why his territory, his carefully mapped hunting ground, had become a trap. Schäfer ordered the submarine to turn, to run, to find escape. But there was no escape. Every direction he moved, the explosions followed. Every evasion maneuver was countered. Every turn was predicted. 05:12 hours, 45 minutes of continuous attack. A depth charge detonated 30 meters from the U-553. The concussion tore through the submarine like a giant fist. Pipes ruptured. Lights flickered and died. Water began seeping through the starboard hull. Not flooding yet, but seeping. Coming. Schäfer was standing in the control room when he realized the truth. The Americans were not hunting him randomly. The Americans were hunting him with mathematics. The Americans had learned his pattern. The Americans had decoded his thinking. It took him only a second to understand this. But understanding it did not change anything. The U-553 was still sinking. The water was still coming. The trap was still closing. 05:47 hours, 90 minutes of continuous attack. The flooding was accelerating now. The U-553 was down to 400 meters below the surface. The hull was screaming. The metal was twisting. 3 more depth charges, and it would be over. Schäfer gave the final order. Surface, all hands prepare to abandon ship. The U-553 rose through the water like a dying whale. She broke the surface at 05:58 hours. Her conning tower was smashed. Her hull was punctured in 6 places. Her crew was dead or dying or about to die. Klaus Schäfer emerged from the conning tower into the cold Atlantic air. The USS Roper was 300 meters away, her guns already aimed at the U-boat. Schäfer stood on the conning tower and watched as his submarine began to sink beneath him. He thought about his wife in Hamburg. He thought about his son who had been born while he was at sea. He thought about the merchant ships he had sunk. 43 ships in 2 years. 478 men dead because of him. 478 men who would never see their families again. 478 Margarets and Davids and mothers and fathers and sons and daughters who would never see them again. Schäfer jumped. He hit the cold Atlantic water at 06:04 hours. The temperature was 3 degrees Celsius. His body immediately began to shut down. His muscles seized, his lungs burned, his brain screamed at him to surface, to breathe, to live. Around him, 37 other men were jumping. Some were screaming. Some had already stopped screaming because they understood they would not survive. Schäfer understood it too. He was in the water, and the water was killing him. The U-553 had been his domain. In the submarine, he was invincible. In the water, he was nothing. Just meat. Just a body that was already cooling, already dying. The USS Roper launched lifeboats at 6:15 hours. The boats moved across the water and pulled men from the sea. Schäfer was pulled aboard at 06:23 hours. His body was blue. His teeth were chattering so hard he could not speak. A Navy doctor examined him. A Navy corpsman wrapped him in blankets. A Navy sailor gave him hot coffee. The Americans were being humane to a man who had just tried to kill them. An hour later, in the captain's quarters of the USS Roper, Schäfer sat across from Captain Hamilton. Schäfer was still shaking with cold. Hamilton was calm. Hamilton had just changed the war. "How did you know?" Schäfer asked. Hamilton placed 40 pages of calculations on the table, maps with predictions, mathematical proof of Schäfer's hunting pattern. Leroy's analysis was written in numbers and logic and the simple understanding that humans are predictable to those who understand how to think like them. Schäfer read the pages slowly. As he read them, his face changed. The arrogance left. The certainty that he was superior left. The understanding that he was a predator hunting inferior prey left. "You stopped me by learning to hunt like me," Schäfer said quietly when he finished reading. "Yes," Hamilton said. "Other commanders will understand now. They will know that the mathematics can be broken. They will change their tactics. But some will not believe until it is too late." "Perhaps," Hamilton said, "or perhaps they will be as confident as you were." In the radio room of the USS Roper at 0730 hours, an operator sent the message back to Naval Command. U-553 sunk. Klaus Schäfer captured. 43 merchant ships will not be avenged. 43 crews will not return to their families. But the next 43 might survive. Theory confirmed. Pattern worked. Merchant ships will live. Because one man refused to accept randomness as an answer. 300 kilometers away, in a different part of the Atlantic, U-boat commander Ernst Emmermann was reading the same message on his intercept radio. Emmermann had been operating in his own territory. Emmermann had developed his own pattern. Emmermann understood immediately what had happened. The Americans had decoded the ocean. The Americans had learned to think like submarines. The Americans were no longer blind. Emmermann felt something he had not felt before. It was not fear exactly. It was the understanding that his territory was no longer his, that his thinking could be read like a book, that every choice he made was visible to an enemy he could not see. Emmermann changed everything. He changed his hunting zone. He changed his schedule. He changed his pattern. But changing his pattern meant losing his efficiency. Losing his efficiency meant losing kills. Losing kills meant losing the war, but not losing his life to a trap. In Washington District of Columbia, in a basement office, Henry Leroy was reading the same message. His hands were shaking. His cigarette had burned down to the filter. 40 pages of calculations had just changed the Atlantic. Admiral Fairfield came down the basement stairs. He moved slowly. He had seen a lot of war. He had seen a lot of theory fail in practice. "You were right," Fairfield said. "I was desperate," Leroy said. "That is not the same thing as being right." "No, sir." But it was right anyway. Fairfield sat down across from Leroy. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Do you understand what we just did?" Fairfield asked. "We changed the Atlantic. We did something more than that. We proved that the mind can defeat the machine. We proved that thinking can defeat strategy. We proved that if you understand your enemy deeply enough, you become the hunter instead of the hunted. We proved that confidence without understanding is just arrogance. What happens now? Now we build a system. Now we take this theory and we apply it to every U-boat commander. Now we create a grid of predictability across the entire Atlantic. Now we start sinking them faster than they can replace them. Now the merchant ships stop burning. And Schäfer? Schäfer is going to a prisoner of war camp. He will be held in Iowa, I believe. He will live out the rest of the war in a cage, knowing that he was defeated not by weapons, but by mathematics. That is a worse prison than any physical cell. Leroy thought of Margaret Brenner. He thought of the letter she would receive. Not a telegram announcing death. A letter, a message from beyond. A message that David Brenner had not died for nothing. that his death had meaning, that his death had contributed to a pattern that was now being broken and decoded and turned into weapons against an enemy that could not adapt fast enough. The hunt had reversed. The prey had become the hunter. The dead were being remembered, and the living would continue to live because one mathematician refused to see the Atlantic as random chaos. Because one man learned to think like a predator. Because one person understood that patterns can be found and broken and used as weapons. The war in the Atlantic had changed. It had changed forever. And it had changed because mathematics had learned to hunt. May 8, 1942, 4 in the morning. The U-454 was hunting in Zone 3 when the USS Roper's sonar found her. The U-boat commander did not know that an American mathematician had predicted his exact location 3 weeks in advance. The commander did not know that destroyers were positioned precisely where he would go. The commander only knew that he had found a merchant convoy. The commander only knew that it was time to strike. He gave the order to attack. The convoy was protected now. It was different from the convoys of March and April. This convoy had teeth. The USS Roper and USS Upshur cut through the water toward the U-boat's position. The depth charges began to fall. For 70 minutes, the U-454 fought. She dove. She turned. She tried every evasion tactic her commander knew, but every direction was wrong. Every maneuver was expected. Every turn brought her closer to the destroyers instead of farther away. The commander understood something was different. Something had changed. The Americans were not searching randomly. The Americans were hunting with precision. At 05:47 hours, the U-454 was forced to surface. Her hull was punctured. Her crew was dying. Her commander had no choice but to abandon ship. 42 men jumped into the Atlantic water. 29 of them would survive. 13 would not. 13 men who would never go home. 13 men who would never see their families. 13 letters that would never be written. That was just the beginning. 5 days later, the U-635 was hunting in Zone 1 when she was attacked by the USS Greer and USS Erickson. Same pattern, same result, same ending. 43 men in the water. 31 survived. 12 did not. 12 more letters that would never be written. But this time something was different. The word was spreading. The message was traveling through the German submarine fleet like poison through water. The Americans had figured it out. The Americans had learned to predict. In a submarine base in France, Ernst Emmermann was reading the casualty reports. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the papers. Schäfer was dead. Not dead like a hero dies in battle. Dead like a prisoner dies. Dead in an American camp. Emmermann had trained with Schäfer. They had hunted together in the Atlantic. They had shared meals and strategies and the understanding that they were superior to their prey. Now Schäfer was a ghost, and Emmermann was reading about other deaths, other commanders, other submarines. Emmermann recognized 3 of the names. He had served with them. He had played chess with them. He had listened to them talk about their families. Now they were all dead or captured or hiding. Emmermann held the casualty report in his hand and understood something that Klaus Schäfer had understood too late. The mathematics was hunting them. The Americans had learned to think like hunters. The Americans had mapped the ocean itself. Emmermann looked at the map of his hunting zone. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at the dates of the other U-boats' attacks. And Emmermann made a decision that would save his life but cost him his purpose. He changed everything. Emmermann moved his hunting zone 400 kilometers north. He abandoned his favorite routes. He stopped hunting at night and started hunting at dawn. He changed his diving schedule. He changed when he surfaced. He changed everything except his fundamental understanding that he was a predator. But a predator that hunted scared was different than a predator that hunted confident. A predator that hunted scared made mistakes. A predator that hunted scared lived longer but caught less prey. Meanwhile, on May 22nd, the U-558 was not as lucky as the U-454 or the U-635. The U-558 was in Zone 4 when she was attacked by the USS Spencer and USS Greba. The attack was ruthless. The depth charges were relentless. The U-boat never surfaced. She went down with all hands. 47 men, all dead, no survivors, no captured crew, no interrogations, just wreckage and silence. 47 men whose families would receive telegrams instead of letters. 47 men who would never come home. 47 men who would never tell their children about the ocean. By the end of May, 3 U-boats had been sunk using Henry Leroy's predictive system. 3 boats. More than 100 men dead. The Atlantic was becoming what Leroy had predicted, a graveyard. In Washington, Admiral Fairfield came to the basement office where Leroy was sitting surrounded by new data. 8 U-boats had been engaged. 8, 3 had been sunk, 4 had been forced to surface, 1 had escaped. The system was working. "We need to expand," Leroy said before Fairfield could speak. "I know. The Germans are adapting. Emmerman went silent 2 weeks ago. We have no intercepts from him, no sightings. He is either hiding or he has changed his entire methodology. Then we change ours too. We create more mathematicians. We train more officers to think like predators. We expand the zones. We make it so there is no hiding place in the Atlantic. How long? Months. But we have months now. Merchant ships are surviving. The bleeding has slowed. We can afford the time to build a system that is perfect." In a prison camp in Iowa, Klaus Schäfer received a letter from his wife. She did not know he was a prisoner. The Red Cross would not allow him to tell her. All she knew was that he was alive. She wrote about their son, who was now 3 years old. She wrote about the food shortages. She wrote about missing him. She wrote about believing he would come home after the war. Schäfer held the letter in his hands and thought about the U-553 at the bottom of the Atlantic. He thought about the men who had died because of him. He thought about the merchant ships that would never sink because of his strategies. He thought about the mathematics that had made him obsolete. He was no longer a predator. He was a memory. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz was reading the casualty reports. His face was very still. Dönitz was a military genius. Dönitz understood submarines better than any man alive. But Dönitz could not understand mathematics. Dönitz could not understand how patterns could be read. Dönitz could not understand how an enemy could know where you were going before you went there. Dönitz had created the U-boat fleet. Dönitz had sent thousands of men to the bottom of the Atlantic. Dönitz had won battles across the ocean. But now Dönitz understood that he was losing a war that he did not know how to fight. Dönitz issued new orders. Stop hunting in predictable patterns. Hunt randomly. Change your zones daily. Change your tactics hourly. Change your coordinates constantly. Do not follow any pattern. Do not think systematically. Hunt like animals, not like machines. But animals are still predictable to those who understand animal behavior. In the basement office in Washington, Henry Leroy received copies of the new German orders through an intercept. He read them carefully. He understood what they meant. The U-boat commanders were going to stop thinking tactically and start thinking defensively. They were going to stop being hunters and start being survivors, which meant they would make mistakes, which meant they would become inefficient, which meant they would stop being a threat. Fairfield came down the stairs. "They are scared now," Leroy said. "Yes, they do not know what to do. They will figure it out eventually. Some of them will, some will not. But for now, we have time. For now, we have the advantage. For now, the mathematics is winning." Leroy thought about all the letters that would never be written. 47 from the U-558, 13 from the U-454, 12 from the U-635, 72 men in total, 72 families who would never see their sons and husbands and fathers again. But hundreds of merchant sailors would live now. Hundreds of families would get letters instead of telegrams. Hundreds of Margarets would receive letters from their Davids. The hunt had reversed. The prey had become the hunter. The Atlantic was becoming what Leroy had predicted, a killing field for German submarines, a graveyard where confidence went to die, and fear was the only thing that kept you alive. 3 weeks later, Ernst Emmermann was at 200 meters, hidden in the darkness of the Atlantic. He was thinking like prey thinks. He was hunting like prey hunts. He was scared. And fear was making him smart. Emmermann did not know that Leroy was watching. Leroy did not know exactly where Emmermann was, but Leroy was ready. Leroy had expanded the zones. Leroy had trained new mathematicians. Leroy had created a web of predictions that covered the entire Atlantic. The hunt was not over. It was just beginning. And mathematics had become the hunter that would not stop hunting until it had won. June 19, 1942. Ernst Emmermann was at 300 meters below the surface of the Atlantic when he stopped thinking like a hunter and started thinking like a hunted animal. His hands were shaking on the submarine's wheel. They were always shaking now. Emmermann had learned that confidence was a death sentence. Emmermann had learned that patterns were suicides. Emmermann had learned to be afraid. 1 merchant ship in 3 weeks, 40 sailors dead. That was all Emmermann had managed to sink since May. Before May, Emmermann would have sunk 4 ships in the same time frame. 180 sailors dead. That was when Emmermann was a predator. Now Emmermann was prey that wore the skin of a hunter. The mathematics had done something worse than kill him. The mathematics had made him invisible. Invisible meant he survived, but invisible meant he could not hunt effectively. Invisible meant the war was continuing, but Emmermann's role in the war was ending. Emmermann understood this completely. He was no longer a weapon. He was no longer necessary. He was just a ghost moving through the Atlantic, trying not to die. In the Atlantic water, at 250 meters, Emmermann's crew was maintaining complete silence. They had not heard a depth charge in 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of safety. But safety meant the U-553 had not attacked anything. Safety meant she had not tried to hunt. Safety meant success had transformed into survival, and survival had transformed into obsolescence. Emmermann looked at the faces of his crew. They were young. Most of them were younger than 25. They had joined the submarine force to be warriors. Now they were learning to be phantoms. Now they were learning that the greatest victory was to remain unseen. Emmermann understood what was happening to them. He was watching men become ghosts in real time. And he was watching it happen because he had chosen this. Emmermann had chosen fear over death. Emmermann had chosen invisibility over capture. Emmermann had chosen to survive instead of to win. And survival was killing him slowly. In Washington, Henry Leroy was sitting at his desk, looking at empty maps. For 2 weeks, there had been no intercepts from Emmermann's submarine, no radio transmissions, no confirmed sightings, no attacks. Emmermann had disappeared. Admiral Fairfield came down the basement stairs. He was moving slower now. The war was aging him at triple speed. "Where is Emmermann?" Fairfield asked. "Gone." "I do not know where. He could be anywhere in the Atlantic, or he could be hiding at the bottom of the ocean thinking like prey." "You had a system that predicted him." "I did. But the system only works on commanders who follow patterns. Emmermann has stopped following patterns. Emmermann is hunting randomly now, which means Emmermann is not hunting at all, which means Emmermann is just surviving. Is that good for us? Yes. But it is also bad for us. We have not stopped the U-boats. We have only made them afraid. But fear makes people think differently. Fear makes them adaptive. Fear makes them dangerous in ways the mathematics cannot predict. Fairfield sat down heavily. He was very tired. His uniform hung loose on him now. The Atlantic was draining him. "We need to think beyond mathematics," Fairfield said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the mathematics works on confident commanders. But not all commanders are confident. Some learn, some adapt. Some figure out that the only way to survive is to stop being soldiers and start being ghosts. And ghosts do not follow patterns. Ghosts follow instinct." Leroy understood. The system had bought time. The system had slowed the killing. The system had even reversed who was hunting and who was hunted. But the system had also taught the enemy something. The system had taught them that confidence dies and fear survives. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz was staring at casualty reports. 12 U-boats lost in 3 months. 12. But more importantly, 3 U-boat commanders had simply vanished. They were out there somewhere in the Atlantic, no longer reporting, no longer attacking, no longer participating in the war in any meaningful way. They had become ghosts. Dönitz understood what this meant. It meant his system of U-boats as aggressive hunters was dying. It meant the old way of thinking was becoming obsolete. It meant the Americans had not just created weapons against his submarines. They had created weapons against his strategy itself. Dönitz issued new orders that told commanders to hunt without pattern, to attack without logic, to become unpredictable not through confusion but through abandoning the very concept of strategy, to stop being soldiers and start being phantoms. But phantoms do not win wars. Phantoms only delay them. In a prison camp in Iowa, Klaus Schäfer received a new letter from his wife. The letter had been written 3 weeks ago and took time to arrive through the Red Cross. His wife wrote about the food shortages. She wrote about the bombing raids on Hamburg. She wrote about his son, who was now 3 years old. She wrote that she had heard rumors that other U-boat commanders were missing. She wrote that she was afraid. Schäfer held the letter and thought about Ernst Emmermann. Emmermann had learned from Schäfer's failure. Emmermann had learned that confidence kills. Emmermann had learned that patterns are death. Emmermann had learned to disappear. But Schäfer also knew something that Emmermann had not yet learned. He knew that disappearing is not winning. Disappearing is just postponing the inevitable. Disappearing is what prey does when it understands it is going to die, but wants to put off the moment as long as possible. Schäfer folded the letter carefully. He put it in his pocket. And Schäfer understood that he had created something worse than a system of defeat. He had created a system that made victory into a curse and survival into a prison. In the Atlantic Ocean, Ernst Emmermann was at 100 meters, completely silent. His engines were barely running. His crew was not hunting. They were waiting. Waiting for what? Emmermann could not have said. Waiting for the war to end? Waiting for the Americans to give up? Waiting for death? Emmermann did not know anymore. He had been a predator. He had killed 43 merchant ships. He had sent 478 men to the bottom of the Atlantic. He had been powerful. He had been superior. He had been alive in the way that killers are alive. Now Emmermann was hiding. Now Emmermann was thinking like prey. Now Emmermann was experiencing something that no predator should ever experience. He was experiencing fear, and fear was teaching him that being a predator was not the same as being alive. Being a predator was just another way of being dead. Because now Emmermann understood that the mathematics was hunting him. The Americans had learned to think like hunters. The Americans had learned to predict. The Americans had learned that patterns kill. And Emmermann had learned to be invisible. In Washington, Henry Leroy was standing in front of his maps. The maps had no predictions now. The maps had no red pins. The maps had only emptiness. The mathematical system that had worked so perfectly 3 weeks ago was already becoming obsolete. Fairfield stood beside him without speaking. "What do you think is happening?" Leroy asked. "I think we are looking at the future of war," Fairfield said. "A future where victory is temporary. A future where the enemy learns. A future where systems do not remain systems for long. Can we stop it? We can slow it. We can adapt. We can create new systems. But the enemy will adapt to those systems too. Eventually, we will reach a point where neither side has an advantage, where neither side understands the other, where both sides are just ghosts hunting ghosts. Then we have not won. No, we have bought time, we have saved merchant ships, we have killed U-boat commanders. but we have also created an enemy that understands that the only way to survive is to become something that cannot be predicted. We have created an enemy that hunts scared, and scared hunters are efficient in ways that confident hunters never are. Leroy thought about the mathematics. He thought about the elegance of systems. He thought about the beauty of prediction. He thought about how all of it was becoming worthless because the enemy had learned the most important lesson of all. The most important lesson was that patterns kill and adaptation survives. In the Atlantic Ocean, Ernst Emmermann was swimming through absolute silence. His submarine was a ghost moving through the water. His crew was not men anymore. They were shadows. They were phantoms. They were the future of war. And in Washington, Henry Leroy was sitting in his basement office, understanding that the war was only just beginning. Not the war against the U-boats, but the war against the understanding that systems could control outcomes. The war against the arrogance that had made him believe mathematics could defeat humanity. The war against the certainty that had made him think understanding the enemy meant winning against the enemy. Because understanding was not victory. Understanding was just the first step on a very long path. And the first step only felt like victory until the enemy learned to walk differently. Emmermann was still alive. Emmermann was still thinking. Emmermann was still somewhere in the Atlantic. But Emmermann was not hunting anymore. Emmermann was just surviving. And survival was teaching him something that mathematics could never teach. Survival was teaching him that the real enemy was not the Americans. The real enemy was the mathematics itself. The real enemy was the system that had made confidence into a death sentence and fear into a way of life. And in that understanding, Ernst Emmermann had become something more dangerous than any hunter could ever be. He had become invisible. Most people think victory ends the war. They're wrong. Victory only begins a new one. If you're ready to think deeper, subscribe. Next chapter will change how you understand strategy forever.